Nefertiti's Tomb by Jace Masters. Arthur looked down upon his team's work victoriously. He had finally uncovered Nefertiti's tomb, and now the path before him lay clear and open. The years of research and months of probing had finally paid off. Content, he looked around the small group of men for his Egyptologist, Max Vargas. Without him, none of this would have been possible. Arthur spotted the man a ways off in one of the lean-tos, studying a book of some sort before shuffling it into the folds of his sand-colored robes. Always checking notes, Arthur thought. It's a miracle we actually got somewhere. Arthur felt a tug on his jacket and looked down at the sallow face of his lead digger, a scraggly and somewhat rat-faced man by the name of Hakir. "Mr. Wheeler, sir," the man's raspy voice grated like the sands they found themselves in. "The men and myself were wondering about our payment." "We discussed this, my good man," Arthur said. "You will receive your dues when we find the tomb we're looking for. You've been amply compensated thus far, and you will receive the rest upon my word." "I believe you, sir, but the men—" "The men believe what you tell them. Now leave Mr. Vargas and myself to explore this tomb so we may reward you when we return," Arthur snapped. Clearly taken aback by the abruptness of Arthur's reply, the lead digger shrunk back and remained silent. "For pity's sake, Arthur," Max's voice interjected. "Give them their pittance." No sooner had he spoken the words or he produced a small bag of the local coin and tossed it to Hakir, who caught it with unnatural speed and agility. "Thank you, Mr. Vargas, thank you." A broad, toothless smile broke the man's haggard face as he spit out the words, while bowing several times and already moved to turn. "That means you'll be waiting here for us, Hakir," Arthur commanded. The rough-faced man did not turn. Yes, Mr. Wheeler, we wait outside for you to return." Arthur turned his attention to his companion. "You're too good to them, Max. Now they'll expect more when we get back." Max scoffed. "Nonsense, my friend. Now they'll take what we give them since we've been so kind, and they won't leave us behind to get buried in this tomb." Noting nothing more of the matter, Arthur turned his attention to the steps leading down into the rectangular-shaped darkness cut into the cliffside before them. Ready to make history, then? More than ready. If this is indeed the tomb of Nefertiti, who knows what riches we'll find in there? Well, Arthur lit a torch and stepped down the rough-hewn stone steps leading down. No time like the present to make history. "Couldn't have said it better myself," Max replied as he joined behind Arthur. As the two made their way down towards the entrance of the tomb, the wind that had been buffeting them for the last few days continued to blow overhead, sweeping sand down into the carved and dug pit. The heavy tarp they had placed above the doorway was already bowing under the weight of it, but it remained firm nonetheless. Beyond the tarp, Arthur could see little more than inky blackness, as if all light beyond was consumed instantly upon touching the interior. He shivered despite himself. Reaching out with his torch in front of him, Arthur placed his left foot firmly on the doorway, paused for a moment, and then proceeded on. The hallway he found himself in was no more than 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. Both men had to awkwardly haunch sideways and forward as they moved to avoid brushing up the smooth walls and hitting their heads on the low ceiling. How small were these people? Arthur said to himself more than anything. Not this small, Max replied. Though this is likely a builder's entrance and not the main entrance of the tomb. Arthur squeezed forward. What makes you say that? Well, the main entrance usually isn't this small, and there's no indication of a name anywhere that I can see. Usually these tombs are quite luxurious and spacious. Let's hope so, because if this is the sizing going forward, we may as well send in Hakir now. Trust me, my friend, there's more here than we're seeing now. There had better be, Arthur thought. I didn't come all this way for some chump change. As he finished his thought, Arthur noticed a shift in the topography of the narrow corridor. He had been aware they had been sloping down for some time now. He estimated about 50 feet or so, but now the sloping evened out. Stretching his torch arm out in front of him, he could make out something not too far off, glistening of some sort. Arthur led the two of them further down, and closer to what he could now see was another stone slab like the one the diggers had removed for them, but with one marked difference. This slab had a cartouche in its center. My ancient Egyptian is a bit rusty, Max, but I do know a cartouche when I see one. Max glanced past Arthur's shoulder, leaning his head onto it as he craned forward, mouthing some sounds to himself. Max remained like this for some time until Arthur felt Max tense up and heard him gasp audibly. Care to share with the class there, Max? Nefertiti. Max's voice was barely audible, even though the only noises were from movement, breathing, and the flames consuming their fuel source. Wait, really? I think so. That's her cartouche all right, though. Fucking A, let's get in there. Arthur moved towards the slab. No, wait! Max shouted as Arthur moved his weight onto the floor in front of him. Arthur felt his foot land, then sag forward and land again. Back behind them, something whirred for a short moment before an echoing snap sounded. It's a trap! Max shouted as he attempted to move his unwilling frame back towards the entrance above them. Arthur just stood on the spot, realizing his error and subsequently thinking that there would be no way back for them if this was what he thought it would be. A sudden rush of air hid both of them as the last light peering in from the top end of the narrow tunnel instantly disappeared. Max's torch, taking the brunt of the burst of wind, was immediately snuffed out, leaving the two of them with Arthur's torch as their only source of light. Arthur instantly moved to shield the torch from the blast as he positioned his body in between the now closed entrance and their last valuable light. The blast hit Arthur just after he turned, causing his jacket to forcefully billow around him. Sand carried by the wind buffeted both men, but Arthur's quick actions saved their last light as the two now found themselves encased in the tomb. After what seemed like a long moment of silence, Arthur spoke first. Side entrance, you said? Dusting himself off and retrieving his now unlit torch, Max replied, Yes? What good is that going to do us now? Well, that means there's a main entrance somewhere in front of us, no? Likely, but we're not getting there anytime soon since we're trapped in this corridor, and I don't think the ancient Egyptians thought breathable air was a necessity for grave robbers. Well, best use that big brain of yours and get us out of here then, preferably before Hakir and his men abandoned us. Both men looked at each other for one moment and spoke in tandem. They're already gone. Arthur sighed. Yep, made off as soon as we got down here, I'm guessing. They must have known. Seems we're not the savvy adventurers we thought, Max said. Hey, perhaps we still can be, if you can get us out of here. Arthur attempted to pour as much optimism into his next sentence. Only way out is forward. All right then, let me get a good look at that cartouche, Max said as he moved closer to Arthur and the marked slab beyond. There was something not right with it. You mean aside from the trap? Max gave Arthur a stern look. Yes, aside from that. Max squeezed himself past his friend, brushing past the loose-fitting Navy Henley he knew hid a variety of weapons beneath it. Arthur always came prepared for a fight, even when it was completely unnecessary. Never hurts to be prepared, he'd always reply to Max or anyone else's questioning glances. Max had to admit the guns in particular had come in handy back in Cairo, scaring a number of would-be robbers off after Arthur placed a few well-aimed shots between a few of their legs. Max smiled at the memory. How crazy things can go, giving the right, or wrong, incentives, he thought to himself as he carefully approached the cartouche in front of him. In the dim light, it shone back at him, the gold used to fashion it not having lost its luster despite the ages it had endured. The script was familiar and ancient Egyptian in nature, the familiar symbols forming their syllabic components of the name within the edges. There was more to it, however. Something had been added below. Someone had carved an additional message below the name. Max recognized the language as Roman Old Cursive, but it had withstood the test of time much less adequately than the original inscription above. Most of the carvings had faded and were illegible, but he could make out some lettering. Tracing his fingers across the carvings, Max spoke. Per lum viventum mo intus aperire. My Latin's a little rusty, Max. What's it say? Arthur asked while holding the torch closer to the etchings. I'm not sure. Max took a moment to think. I think viventum means living, and I'm pretty sure aperire means open. Intus is inside, I think, so something about living inside an opening? Excellent, Arthur said. So there's living Romans in there? If they found it, then it's likely empty already. Only one way to find out. Let me try something, Max said as his fingers traced the outline and then the symbols making up the cartouche. Ah, got it. As Max pressed his index finger into the circular hieroglyph with a point in it, a click was audible from the other side of the slab. Or maybe it came from inside it. As the click reverberated through the long hallway they were standing in, the stone slab began receding into the wall to the right, grinding its way across the floor and ceiling until it came to a rest with a thud, slotting into a purpose-made space in the walls. Sneaky Egyptians. Arthur stepped forward, holding the torch in front of him to light the way forward. They really knew how to hide things, didn't they? Still looking at the now receded slab, Max replied, If I didn't know it was there, I couldn't tell you that that wasn't just another part of this hallway. Ingenious construction. Ignoring Mash's gushing, Arthur gave him a slight push and nodded forward. Let's keep going. Right, Max said as he retrieved this doused torch from the floor, relit it from Arthur's, and moved forward into the chamber beyond. As their torches lit the area in front and around them, the two caught their first glimpses of the true interior of the tomb. 2 pillars stood in the center of the chamber, one on either side of the entrance they had used. The chamber measured around 30 feet wide by 20 feet long from their perspective. As soon as they stepped into the room, the two could fully stretch again, the 8-foot ceiling allowing them ample space. The room appeared to lack any manner of decoration, leaving its only distinctive feature to be the mason's mark in the ceiling. Arthur stepped past Max and quickly surveyed the room's features. Well, can't speak for you, but I'd hope for a little, more. This all seems a little bare for Nefertiti's tomb. We're not there yet, Max replied. This is just an antechamber. There should be a way down for us, as well as a way up and out. Oh, you mean like a stairway leading up? The tone of Arthur's voice betrayed the underlying sarcasm, because I do believe we're out of luck on that front. Max moved into the room proper and discovered what Arthur was referring to. As he moved to the northern side of the chamber, he saw a doorway leading to a second chamber. A drop of at least 20 feet, he calculated before looking back up. Following Arthur's torch pointing forward along the wall, he saw it, a cave-in that blocked their way up. Guess we go down then, Arthur said dejectedly. Unlikely to be a way out, but unless you brought dynamite this time, I think we have little other choice now. Not since that last incident with the truck. Shh! Out of the corner of his eyes, Arthur caught movement. A shadow had moved across the far side of the chamber from where they were standing. Silently, Arthur bade Max to move aside as he drew one of his revolvers and held it out alongside the torch. He slowly began moving sideways to clear the pillars from his field of view and bring whoever had entered the chamber into his sight. Step by gentle step, he edged further away from his companion and toward the other side of the chamber, the only noise coming from the torch's flames and the gentle sliding of his feet as they landed on the dust-laden floor. Arthur kept moving sideways, foot by foot, until he had nearly reached the other side of the chamber wall. Nothing moved. No shadows, no people, nothing. Had he imagined it? He looked towards Max questioningly and nodded in the direction of the opposite side of the chamber. Max shrugged in response, apparently not having seen what he saw, but began moving forward. On either side of the pillars, the two began edging towards the chamber's eastern wall and the stairway leading down. Arthur still armed with his weapon, Max holding out the torch as his primary defense. As they moved, no other sounds reached them. The only source of sound was the pair of them, torches burning and feet shuffling. Upon reaching the stairwell leading down, Arthur resolved that he had just imagined the movement and let out a relieved sigh. Max took the sigh as a sign the air was clear to talk and immediately spoke in a hushed tone. What was that all about? Nothing, thought I saw movement. Max scoffed. We're the only two living things in here, my friend. Your mind is playing tricks on you. Yeah, I believe so too, yeah. But let's be careful going forward. I don't want to be setting off any more traps. No need to tell me. I didn't trip the last one. Max shifted his weight forward to look down the stairwell in front of him. The moment he did, the floor he stood on gave way ever so gently as a click was once again audible throughout the chamber, instantly followed by the low, rumbling grating of stone moving upon stone. The doorway! Both men said simultaneously as they both sped towards the entrance they had come from. Recessed into the wall, the slab was indeed moving back across, closing the way before them. Arthur managed to reach the slab first in time for him to attempt to block it with his torch. He placed a burning wood implement perpendicular to the slab and held it there. Undisturbed by the piece of wood, the stone slab moved forward, bowing the wood before snapping it as if it had been a toothpick. Shit! Arthur looked around for anything of use, but could see nothing that would aid him in blocking the slab's relentless progress across the doorway. Then, in the dying light of his shattered torch, he saw Max approaching with something heavy in his hands. Stone, a piece of rubble from the cave-in. Moving much slower than Arthur would have wanted, the other man hobbled forward, shifting his weight so as not to tip over on his way. About 3 feet out, Max threw all his strength into a toss forward and flung the piece of stone towards the doorway, now only inches wide. The piece of debris lunged forward, landed with a loud thud just before the doorway, and toppled over itself twice before coming to a rest in the path of the slab. The slab approached, moved, and pinned the stone, but it seemed unable to overcome the dense structure of it as a crunching sound became audible from the walls themselves. The sound lasted for some time as the stone slab unsuccessfully attempted to crush the object that had been placed in its path. Finally giving out, the crunching ended and was instead replaced by a faster whirring noise. Must have destroyed the gears, Arthur finally spoke, still eyeing the now very thin doorway warily. Quick thinking with the stone. Thanks, Max replied, clearly out of breath. I'm beginning to dislike this tomb. Me too. All this effort and still no way out or treasure. As the last splinters of Arthur's torch gave out and breathed their last spouts of flame, the men retraced their steps in the semi-dark and retrieved Max's torch from where he placed it before grabbing the stone. Last one. Better not lose this one, or it's lights out, Max said as he handed it to Arthur. Yeah, let's hope they have something to light downstairs. It's likely. If not, there's always the mummies, Arthur said with a lighter tone in his voice. Don't you dare! Not unless they come for us. The men proceeded carefully down the stairwell before them, the only way not blocked to them. Arthur led the way as they descended stairs, a sloped landing and another set of stairs, before ending down in a smaller chamber 10 feet long and 6 feet wide. As the light shone down into the room, Arthur first saw the scene before them. You might want to check this out, Max, Arthur said in a hushed tone. I think we found our Romans. Romans? You mean they're actually still here? Excitement was clearly present in Max's voice. Well, it doesn't look like they're going anywhere, no. Max moved up to overtake Arthur so he could see, but the sight he saw caused him to immediately stop beside him. What? Bodies lay strewn across the floor of the room. A group of no less than 6 individuals made up the scene before them. The fact that they were there had not stopped Max in his tracks. He had gotten used to seeing bodies in various states of decay for preservation for some time now. Becoming an Egyptologist brought a certain amount of morbid curiosity with it, after all. The thing that stopped him and caused him to stare at the sight below was the state of the bodies. These men had not been interred here, obviously, but they had not met their ends in any manner common to archaeology either. Suffocation or blunt force trauma were the 2 main causes of death for remains discovered in the field. Not exsanguination, not dismemberment. The walls of this chamber had been plastered and painted with some form of ancient Egyptian rite for entry into the afterlife, but a large portion of it had also been covered in what could only be described as enormous sprays of blood, as if someone had thrown buckets against the wall in an effort to block out the images underneath. The floor was littered with body parts, most of which had been preserved quite well in the dark, low-temperature surroundings. The most haunting sight, however, were the heads of the men. All 6 had been placed in a circle, facing outwards, with the perfectly preserved body of a snake in its center. What kind of mumbo-jumbo is this, Max? Arthur's voice quivered as he spoke. Max attempted to sound as cool and unmoved as possible. I'm not sure. This is unlike anything I've ever encountered, to be honest. Just our luck. Get trapped in a tomb, and it's the one with added decorations. Hesitantly, the two continued their way down to the last steps in front of them and onto the chamber proper, both attempting to move as gingerly as possible in order not to disturb the room, Arthur with his trusty revolver at the ready. Max moved towards the center of the room, towards a circle of heads to get a better view. Like the rest of the parts strewn about, the heads were reasonably well preserved, mummification due to environmental influences. Oddly enough, their features had remained frozen in whatever state they were in when they died, mouths agape, eyes wide, a look of terror on their faces. Arthur, meanwhile, had made his way to the northern side of the space. First intrigued by the distinct lack of blood spatter on the farthest section of the wall, he had discovered a ramp down that hinted there was more beyond the wall that he was standing in front of, but there was no indication of a door or other passage. He let his free hand glide across the rough, textured plaster, felt cold to the touch, and left a thin film of moisture on his hand. Odd, he thought as he wiped his hand on his shirt. "Come take a look at this," Arthur said. Max walked up to the same area, making sure not to disturb anything on his way there. "That's odd. I would have guessed these men would have definitely broken through that." "Yeah, it's strange. We'll have little other choice than to go through, I think." Max looked hesitant. "I'm not too sure we should. Looking at what happened to these men, who knows what's behind this?" "You know of any other way out of here?" Arthur asked, while still inspecting the plaster before them. "Not really, no," Max sighed. "Not even sure if there's one to be found, if I'm honest." "So, we keep going." The determination in Arthur's voice was palpable. Before Max could even respond, Arthur had already retrieved a desiccated femur from one of the unfortunate souls on the floor and began slamming it into the plastered wall. "Okay, so we're doing that then," he responded dryly. Arthur's response was nothing more than a mid-swing shrug as he continued to lay into the plaster, slowly but surely revealing and splintering the layer of wood underneath it. After what seemed like a number of long minutes of hammering, peeling, and breaking, the men had made a hole large enough to fit through. Dropping the now battered and pockmarked femur, Arthur was the first to step through into the darkness on the other side of the hole, followed by Max's torch and Max himself shortly after. They found themselves in the most decorated room yet. The walls were plastered and painted with a mural depicting several figures in classic ancient Egyptian side-profile views. Although the reliefs had to have been thousands of years old, they appeared vibrant and unweathered, almost unnaturally so. The room itself had 4 pillars supporting the weight of the ceiling and hillside above them. These had been left bare, stark white plaster contrasting the colors of the outer walls. A little over 10 feet beyond their improvised entrance, steps down led to a lower landing, where a familiar sight greeted the men. A large rectangular stone sarcophagus stood alone in the middle of the landing, its black stone seeming to absorb the light of the torch as the men approached instinctively. Max studied the reliefs on either side of the passage they were heading down. He recognized many of the figures present, Anubis, Osiris, Hathor in their various forms. Something was off about the figures, though. Where they would normally be depicted as presenting the entombed with unks, representing the gift of a life anew, these deities were withholding the unk and presenting the amenta, a symbol he knew represented the underworld, instead. "Something's very wrong here," Max said, noticing he was shivering as he looked at the reliefs around him. "I don't see anything wrong. I see what we came here for, an intact burial chamber with an unopened sarcophagus," Arthur said as he continued his way down to the lower landing. "These gods are withholding life from this person, not granting it like they're normally depicted." Another shiver ran down Max's spine. "They are presenting the amenta, meaning they wanted this person to remain in the underworld for some reason." Arthur had reached the sarcophagus, leaning over it, inspecting it closely. "Let them. All I'm interested in is what this little lady is worth, and what items of value she might have on her. Come over here, help me identify her." Max realized he was still staring at the glyphs. "Right," he murmured as he willed his legs to move towards the obsidian sarcophagus. "Strange design," he noted as he looked at it. "They're usually constructed out of limestone. This appears to be obsidian. Does that mean it's worth more? Maybe it's a rarity. Might even be unique. Arthur grinned at Max in the torchlight. I like that word, unique. Sounds like money. Max approached what he believed to be the top of the sarcophagus. There should be some indication of who this was carved into the stone, a name, titles, that sort of thing. There's some scribbling here. Arthur pointed toward the side he was facing. Looks like hieroglyphs and a cartouche of some sort. Like the one we encountered on the way in? Arthur shook his head. No, it's been damaged somehow. It's hard to make out. Let me see, Max said as he moved in closer. Give me some more light, will you? Arthur sighed under his breath, but obliged. So, what's she worth? Anything good? As the light reflected off of the obsidian stone, Max could clearly make out the markings, or rather lack thereof. The cartouche had been defaced, and the name and title upon the stone had been chiseled off. Someone did not want anyone to be able to identify this person. The name, titles, and even the sacred spells had been chiseled off. So someone disliked our unique friend a bit, Arthur stated dryly. More than dislike, they did not want this person to go into the afterlife, a terrible fate for anyone in that culture. Well, since she's not in the afterlife, I'm just going to assume she'll be fine with us opening up this then. Arthur tapped the butt of his gun on the dark stone. Let's just be careful. We don't know if and how they might have rigged this. Yeah, just help me open this up, okay? After a few hesitant glances from Max, both men positioned themselves next to the top right half of the obsidian slab. All right, Arthur said while holstering his gun and leaning down on the cold stone. Push in 3, 2, 1, push! Both Arthur and Max put all their weight into pushing the lid of the sarcophagus. Max felt the heels of his shoes begin to slide as he pushed. Repositioning himself, he found a small ledge for his foot to hook into to prevent it from slipping and began pushing again. Meanwhile, Arthur's hands were white at the knuckles from the pressure he was applying. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his forehead, making its way down his quivering cheekbones. At first it seemed like their effort was in vain and the lid would not budge. After several moments of applying pressure, readjusting and applying pressure again, they heard and felt the low rumble of stone grinding across stone as the lid gave way. Once it began moving, it was as if the lid itself wanted to keep moving, as the two felt it slide away from their grips nearly instantly. With a low rumbling grind, the stone slid off the sarcophagus and dropped onto the floor with a heavy thud, kicking up a considerable amount of dust and loose sand as it did. Before either man had a chance to look inside the receptacle to see the treasure they had potentially uncovered, a burst of air and dust blinded them. Coughing, Max stepped back and instinctively rubbed his burning eyes. He heard a loud swish. Somehow it reminded him of the guard patrols in front of the Cairo Museum. When the guards changed shifts, they would always perform this ceremonial act of handing over their scimitar to the next guard on duty. An impressive sight. As he stood there, hunched over, trying to recover his breath, the noise left the forefront of his mind as he finally cleared enough dust out of his eyes to be able to open them again. He saw nothing. Darkness all around. The burst of air must have doused the torch, he thought. Arthur? You all right? There was no reply. Arthur? Can you light the torch again? Still nothing but darkness all around. Max couldn't even see his hands in front of his face at this point. He registered the dust settling around him as the air became easier to breathe. He could hear liquid dripping somewhere behind him, likely where that moisture on the false wall came from. As he reached out, his hands felt the cold stone of the open sarcophagus in front of him. Its cool surface provided some relief in the sense of where he was within the room. When we open it, Arthur was standing to my left, Max reasoned. He slowly moved his foot left and carried his weight onto it, while holding on to the ledge of the sarcophagus, keeping his anchor. He repeated this several more times before his foot bumped into something that gave way. There you are, Arthur. Don't scare me like that. Again, there was no response. Come on, stop playing around, my friend. Nothing. Max kicked the foot beside his hard, moving it away slightly. No sound emanated from Arthur beside the shuffling of his clothing. Starting to feel concerned for his colleague now, Max crouched down beside the sarcophagus, using its unwavering presence to keep himself steady. He reached out and found Arthur's feet. No, his arm? Max's heart was racing. The lack of sensory input made him jump at every noise he heard, including the rushing of his own blood. Even the slightest of movement produced what felt and sounded like a cacophony of noise. He swore he could taste the metal of his own blood in the air on top of that. Whispering, Max said, "Arthur? Get up if you can, my friend. You have the torch." There was no response. The arm he was holding also did not move. As he lifted it up, a strong smell of copper suddenly hit him. He instantly let go of the arm, causing it to drop onto the floor with a wet thud. Slowly realizing what might have befallen his friend, Max reached out his hand to touch the floor. It slid across it without resistance, warm moisture clinging to it as he withdrew it. "Oh God," Max whimpered. In a flurry of hasty movement, Max patted his own clothes down to determine if he had brought one thing that could help him in this situation. He had to see, he had to have light, he needed to find a way out, and he needed light to do it. Still crouching, Max patted himself down until he located the familiar rectangular box in the sash around his waist. He pulled out the box, slid it open to reveal its contents, and grabbed one of the matches within. Before striking it, he hesitated for a moment, debating whether he indeed needed to see what he was expecting to see before he struck the match across the side of the box. A bright flash blinded his eyes as the match burst into flame between his fingers. After blinking a number of times to force them to adjust, he looked in Arthur's direction. His friend's body was lying in a pool of its own lifeblood. His arms lay outstretched towards the sarcophagus, but his feet, and indeed his entire lower half, were behind him, slumped against the far wall. Max instinctively looked at his friend's head, but was unable to find it. A clean cut had separated it from its place on Arthur's shoulders. Regretting his decision to light the match, Max moved back the way he came so as to avoid triggering the same trap again. "I will not die here. I will not die here. I will not die here." He silently repeated the words to himself as he moved, inching away from the pooling blood of his late friend. He reached the edge of the sarcophagus just as his match became too hot for his fingers to bear, and he involuntarily threw it to the floor in front of him. Pitch-black darkness immediately overtook the room again as the dull glow of the dying flame quickly faded. Max struck another match on the box. Expecting the burst, he squinted to protect his eyes from the brightness and opened them again as the flame settled on the small piece of wood. Holding the source of light out in front of him, he edged around the corner of the sarcophagus to get his bearings and locate the stairs he had come down from before. The light of the match reflected in the polished side of the stone casket with an eerie dark glow, but everything he expected to be there was still there, unmoving. There was something more, though. Someone stood on the stone steps leading back up. A full head of dark blonde, swept-back hair was looking at the doorway beyond. "Arthur?" Max questioned without thinking. Arthur looked back, cocking his head in a jerky, unnatural movement akin to that of a spider moving its legs. Blank, dead eyes stared into Max. The rest of the body turned with the same unnatural, instantaneous jerks of movement. Before he could react, the figure was in front of him. The smell of decay and desiccated flesh slammed into Max's flaring nostrils, but he was unable to move. He now saw the figure was wrapped in dirty linen cloth, which had decayed beyond repair in several areas, revealing the blackened skin underneath. Blood spatter, both old and brown as well as crimson and fresh, was clearly visible now, as was the golden khopesh in the creature's hand. Arthur's lifeless head stared intently at Max, as if it were trying to peer through or into him. After a long moment, the creature opened its mouth, Arthur's unwilling flesh seemingly belatedly following its command. Arthur's tongue unrolled itself within the mouth, but no sound other than a guttural hiss made its way out of it. Still frozen in fear, Max held on to the burning match in his hand as long as he could. He felt the tiny flames searing through the flesh on his fingertips before his instincts overcame him, and he threw the match to the floor. Darkness once again engulfed him. To this day, it is still unknown how many tombs reside in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. Archaeologists and Egyptologists still discover new tombs regularly as the shifting sands reveal their secrets over time. Some secrets, however, may be best left forgotten to the sands of time. If you have any questions or remarks, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and a special thanks to my Patreon supporters for making these stories a reality. If you've enjoyed this story and want to support the creation of more, please consider joining my Patreon and unlocking exclusive stories, behind-the-scenes content, virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this story, please share it, and check out my other stories, and subscribe for more tales yet to be told.